Hello everybody, my name is Shary Bartlett and I am here giving you an Instagram Live, and I am here to talk about my encaustic photographs, and I will happily take questions at the end of my session, which will be about 15-20 minutes or so. But today I wanted to talk about how I use encaustic on photographs. Encaustic, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is a combination of beeswax and resin. So not polymer resin, but tree resin, damar resin from a tree. So these two are combined, and the reason for that is that it raises the temperature of the ability for the wax to be heated. It adds a kind of a hardness to it, and it can be buffed to a beautiful sheen. So it really adds a lot to photographs, and I'll talk to you a little bit about how that works and how I use it. I have about maybe 15 or 20 photos to show you today. A lot of them are really small. I also am going to do my best to show you a few slides. This is only my third Instagram Live and I'm still learning about it, so I have some slides up to show you, and hopefully those will work as well. So I wanted to say, by way of introduction, the reason that I love working with encaustic and photographs is that I feel like it adds a real magic. That wax adds a real magic to the photo. I don't know if you've had this experience, but many times for me, I have taken a photograph and I've been really moved by the moment. It's just gorgeous. And I will take a photo with my camera or with my phone, and then I will get it home and I'll look at it and I think, wow, that just doesn't capture the magic of that moment. And so what I have tried to do, because I love encaustic so much, is I've tried to recapture that moment and invigorate it and add an interpretation into it so that it becomes much more painterly. Encaustic is an ancient art form that goes back to very early Greek and Roman and Egyptian times, and it is being used in since around the early 2000s or so. It's been used in all kinds of amazing ways and applying it to a lot of modern materials. So in this case, I'm using it to apply to photographs. One of the things that I love about photography and encaustic is that it adds this kind of milkiness. You might be able to see that a little in the photographs behind. I'm going to show you a lot more close-up photos. Hopefully you'll be able to catch that. But it adds this really milky, slightly milky but translucent depth to it. And encaustic is applied layer upon layer and fused every time. So there's a sense of looking deeply into the photo that is that really adds a sense of character to it, I find. As I said, it can be buffed to a very bright shine, and I find that when I'm adding texture in, I can add surface texture as well, and I find that it really draws people into the photograph. They're really curious about looking at that photograph more deeply, and I find that that gives the viewer an opportunity to try and catch that feeling that I had when I took that photo. It may look quite different when I've finally finished working with it, but it is trying to capture what that feeling was. I think part of why encaustic can do that is that the wax is a living material. It's produced by the bees, and I feel like it adds a kind of living energy. It adds that ability for that photograph to project in a different way to the viewer. And I also love this idea of wax as a preservative. If you think of your grandmother's jams that had that layer of wax on top to preserve it, I love that idea of preserving that moment that I took that photograph, when I took that photograph, and preserving it and recreating it for the viewer, just like Grandma's jam. And again, adding in all of those textural surface layers, the color that I add in, the feeling that I'm wanting to try to communicate is not only that feeling of that moment, but also is this a photo or is this a painting? So when you see things a little bit more close up, you'll be able to see that. So generally when I work with photographs, I hand alter them first. So I'm going to start showing you a few photographs here. So I may take a photograph and start to alter it. And again, the light's not going to be great here, but I will start to distress the surface. So I'll scratch into it, I'll take sandpaper to it, I may crunch it up, tear it. So I really abuse that surface in a lot of ways in that first process of setting up that underpainting. And then I will put wax on it. So here you can perhaps see that sheen of that wax. This is essentially the same photograph that I've reworked and added the wax on top. This is a photograph, the same photo but in color. And again, you can see that wax on that surface. So it adds that kind of milky depth, that luminosity as well. Again, not very easy to show on a video. And then often what I will do is add color in. So this photograph has oil color added. And one of the things about wax, as I mentioned, is that you have to fuse every layer. So there's lots of opportunities to add, when you're adding the heat, the pigments that I've added to the surface, either paint, as in encaustic wax with colored pigments in it, or sometimes I use an oil stick that is specifically designed for encaustic. Sometimes also chalk pastels I will add in. So I'm going to just show you a couple of examples of how I might alter a surface. Oh, I wanted to also say that what I will often do is add textural marks. So here I've taken clay tools and dug into that surface of that wax, added color on top. So there's this opportunity to work with the layers that I love about working with this medium. Also, I can add surface texture in. So here I have some three-dimensional beads in here that add some texture. Of course, you can add all kinds of plant material or other objects in there as well. So I find that that depth really adds some interest into the surface texture. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the subject matter that I love to work with. I love nature, which I will talk about in a few minutes, but I wanted to talk first about travel because I adore traveling and I love taking photographs while I'm traveling. And again, I often find when I get home, those photographs don't really capture the feeling that I had, how I was touched by the people or how beautiful the place was, what that experience was. So I try to recapture that with the wax and the photographs. So I've got a couple of pictures here. This is the same picture. This is taken in Guatemala, a young girl on the steps of the cathedral at Chichicastenango. And this young gal was obviously very bored. I don't know if you can see her. She's kind of lost in the background. She was so overtaken by all of the flowers that obviously she had to sell every day and wanted to be somewhere else. And I was really taken by that moment. So what I did was I really worked up the surface of those flowers. And again, not sure if you can see that, but I essentially took a wire heated brush with the encaustic paints and added those to the surface. So maybe move it around and perhaps you can get a little bit of a sense of that. One of the great things about working with photographs is you can start again and use another photograph. So in another piece, I actually used a different material here. This is oil stick that are added in. So that has a really different effect. It adds that smooth depth in there course, the same photo here, the girl lost and overtaken by all of these flowers, but a very different effect of that. So I have a couple more photos from travels. And I'll talk a little bit about how I made them. More pictures from Guatemala, a weaver, and a couple of photos of how beautiful the people are. And I love this aging woman, and obviously a hard worker. One of the things I can do when I'm hand altering those photos is I can work that surface. So I talked about sanding out, and I can remove parts of the photo that I don't want. I don't work digitally with these photos, so obviously one can go through and digitally erase parts of the photo, but there's something I love about working with my hands and erasing them by hand. So another photo of this woman, and here you can see that I've worked the texture of that surface. So a lot of the paintings I create are very smooth in surface. This one I stamped in with some stamps, batik stamps actually, that I purchased in Bali on a trip. So you can really play with that surface texture with Encaustic, and that's something I really enjoy as well. Another photo, another Guatemalan photo. I loved this moment of this boy kind of caught between young manhood and boyhood. And again, this ability with the encaustic paint to add texture in there, and also to erase parts of the photograph that I didn't want. So for me, this is a great opportunity to capture those travel moments and try to communicate to the viewer how touched I was by that moment. So I'm going to just flip over to my photos, hopefully. Show you a few. As I said, this is new to me, so I'm just trying to figure it out. There we go. This is again a photo of that weaver that I just showed you. Again, just to give you a little bit of a sense of what these photos look like, because I'm not really sure how they come across on Instagram. So you can get a little sense of that close up. This is the piece that I have behind me, and I'll show you it here in a little bit of detail because I think it won't show too well on the wall. This is a photograph taken in Peru, in Arequipa in Peru, and what I wanted to do was really work up the visual texture of that surface. So I worked with something called water-soluble wax paints. So this was something that took a lot of working with to try to manipulate it as I wanted, and also to be able to fuse it into the surface. So I will show you a few close-ups of this so you can get a bit of a sense of what that looks like in detail. So I was able to work with the photograph and then add paint on the surface, distress the photograph as well, and really bring out the beauty of that background texture. The buildings in Peru and Guatemala are amazing to see, so I really just loved the architecture, and I'll be talking about that a little bit later. One more picture here, again using this water-soluble wax, painting onto the surface of a photograph. This is an old photo of my daughter. So one of the things I wanted to talk about as well is nature, another subject that I'm very interested and inspired by. So again, encaustic wax can bring a lot of interest to that surface. You might see here that I've been able to paint on the surface, adding a surface layer of brushwork and scratching into that surface as well. This is a similar photo to the one I just showed you, but this one I've hand colored, so I've got oil sticks that I've added that color into. I take a lot of inspiration from the outdoors, and photography I've found really helps me to develop an eye for noticing the little things, noticing things that I find are beautiful, and really inspiring me with new ideas to bring back into the studio. Gives me an opportunity for spiritual reflection and just noticing this wealth of beauty in nature that really finds its way into my work. And I love documenting that cycle of growth and decay as well, and that whole cycle of life. I love trying to communicate that through my photographs. I'm also interested in natural phenomenon, animals and insects and that sort of thing. Again, an example of a photograph that is worked on that surface. These photographs are from Bali here. You can see, this is one I showed you earlier where I had actually dug into the surface of the wax and added oil paints down into that surface. Again, this one has pastel as well, chalk pastel. This photograph uses cold wax. So cold wax is basically like an encaustic wax, but it has solvent added. So you can work in a much more textural way with it, and it is a very fun material to use as well. Again, an example of adding color onto the surface, distressing the surface, and really transforming what was a boring picture initially of driving down the road and bringing it to life in a very different way, trying to translate that moment. More textural surfaces in nature. And another area that I'm really interested in is architecture. So I have had a lot of fun working with, playing with architectural elements and working in a more abstract kind of way, just scratching out areas, adding in, trying to again inspire the photograph with the energy of the moment, and also making it almost more dramatic sometimes than it actually was. Again, just an ordinary bridge, looking underneath a bridge, but that ability to infuse it with story that I find really interesting. And I wanted to speak just about this last piece. This is the same one that I have behind me. I forgot to show you this. I'll just go back to this picture from Arequipa. We'll go back to me here. Bear with me here. Here is a picture of this woman that I showed you earlier. So again, hard to see the details of this one, but very full of a lot of details. So this last piece that I showed you is behind me here, and perhaps I'll just move my camera a little bit so maybe you can see it a little more fully. A lot of people looking at this photo think it's a picture of a forest, and it does have that feeling for sure. I worked this painting, I worked on the surface, carving into it initially to set up the underpainting, and then I added water-soluble wax on top. And also, you may not be able to see that, but these are very fine gold lines in here. So what I was trying to do was really set up this sense of being surrounded by a forest, that feeling of being cocooned by a forest and calmed by that. Again, this has got quite a textured surface that doesn't come across on the video, but it does have a very enveloping feeling, I think, and I love this one. It actually is not a forest. It is the hydrangeas in my backyard in winter. winter, so it's quite hard to see, but these are actually hydrangea with snow on them. So again, it's an opportunity to really try to capture the feeling and not necessarily follow the photograph just as it came across when I printed it. So just a mention about the printing. I print on acid-free paper and I use archival inks. I have my photographs professionally printed and then add this encaustic material on top. And what that does using a professional photograph is it makes sure that the colors aren't fugitive, that it won't fade. So I am going to take questions in a couple of minutes, but if you're interested in seeing more of my photos, you can take a look at my website. Also, I have a video that I've made about this process of working with photographs that's on YouTube if you want to check that out. And I did an IG Live last week looking at the techniques that I use for encaustic, and you might want to check that as well. I put up posts every two times a day just to kind of keep people informed about the art that I'm doing that day or what's inspiring me, and hopefully inspire other people to make art, because making art is so great. So I'm going to just open it up to questions if you have any. So I'll wait a couple more. I found that the other day comments questions came in slowly, so I'll just talk a little bit more just in case there are some that come through. One of the things I do also is I add material into the wax. I mentioned about that, how I can add material from the environment. So I may pick up a leaf or something that comes from that place. So that is another way of adding in that sense of place. Thank you for your comments, Amanda and Jill and Daniel. Carmen, a question about yesterday. Have you put wax over the alcohol ink? So I did a demo yesterday on alcohol inks. If you're interested in that, I didn't mention that. That is the bulk of the work that I have in my show here. And the answer is no, I don't. I find that if I add a layer of wax over the alcohol inks, that it obscures the beautiful luminosity of the alcohol ink, and so I don't do that. You can, of course, but it's going to bury that layer in there, which might be something that might look great. It just isn't something I tend to do. So, silver brown, love the watercolor belt on the Guatemalan woman. Is that Vera colors, Sarah colors? Yes, lovely velvet dress. It is Sarah colors, yes. So Sarah colors is a paint made by a company called Natural Pigments, and it essentially looks like an oil paint or an acrylic paint, but it's a water-based paint, but it is made with wax. So and also materials that are used for makeup, sort of common materials for makeup. So it gets applied like a paint, and it can be mixed. They also sell mediums that you can mix in with the pigments as well. It is a challenge to use on encaustic wax, I found. The plus of it is that it can be fused into the surface, and cold wax, because it has solvent in it, can't be fused into the surface. So cold wax adds a wonderful surface texture, but if you fuse it both, it will melt, and it's extremely toxic. So I experimented quite a bit with these Sarah colors and really enjoyed them, but if you try them, you'll have to work with them a little bit. So I'll take a couple more questions. Got one here. I love how you tried to recapture the original feeling when you took the photograph. Do you sometimes try to tell different stories with different processes? Yes, I do. For example, with this painting here that wasn't a forest at all, I really wanted to tell that story of what that feels like to be surrounded by a forest. And so that is a totally different story than taking a photograph of my hydrangea out the back garden. I also have used photographs to tell more political stories, talk about some of the travels that I do, some of the things that I've learned on those trips, or as I mentioned yesterday, I'm very interested in the environment and increasingly in the marine environment. So a lot of the work that I'm doing now is really exploring that and how the effects of climate change are affecting the marine environment as well. So you'll probably see more of those kind of photos. I would love to be able to be an underwater diver and take photos underneath, but I'm stuck taking pictures on the surface of the earth. So I'll just take a couple more questions if anybody else has any. Thank you, Nico, for joining. So if you don't have any more questions, I will sign off shortly. But if you didn't catch this IG Live, you can find me on IGTV. So just scroll on over there, and as I said, I have a demonstration that I did last week for the encaustic process, and I applied that demonstration to not only photographs, but I talked about alcohol ink, did some demos on that. I worked with collage a little bit and showed people how to use different colors, how to use oil sticks and pastels, that sort of thing. So it's a little bit more of a how-to, but it'll give you a little bit of insight into how I achieve this process with the photographs. And yesterday I did an IG Live on alcohol inks and how I use alcohol inks. So thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to keeping in touch. Might be back next week, so take care. Bye-bye.